What happens when an entire civilization gets bored? It invents fun that looks a lot like insanity. We're about to show you 32 forms of ancient entertainment so brutal, weird, and downright dumb, you'll wonder how humanity even survived. Forget what you learned in school. This is the stuff they left out. 1. Let's talk about the public baths of ancient Rome, which were less about hygiene and more about being the chaotic, steamy social network of the ancient world. Picture your local country club, a political gossip forum, and a questionable public pool all merging into one massive, echoing marble structure. This was the place to seal a business deal, hear the juiciest rumors, show off your glistening muscles, and maybe pick up a mysterious skin condition. The grandest bathhouses were practically self-contained cities, complete with snack bars, libraries, and probably a few spies lurking in the steam, because nothing loosens the tongue quite like being naked, sweaty, and surrounded by hundreds of equally naked strangers. 2. A round of applause for Lucian of Samosata, a 2nd century Greek writer who was basically the world's first professional internet troll, but with parchment. This mad genius penned a work titled A True Story, which was, of course, a spectacular mountain of lies. It describes a casual trip to the moon, where he immediately gets caught up in a cosmic war between the Sun King and the Moon King, complete with armies of gigantic space spiders and soldiers that are just sentient mushrooms. Later, he's swallowed by a whale so colossal, it contains an entire civilization in its belly. This wasn't just sci-fi. It was a masterclass in sarcasm, a giant literary middle finger to other writers who were passing off their own absurd travel stories as fact. 3. Forget the polite, strategic game of chess you know today. Its ancient Indian ancestor, Chataranga, was a 4-player free-for-all that was less about intellectual pursuit and more about simulating total, brutal warfare on an 8-8-8-8 grid. It was like a game of Risk on steroids. Each player commanded their own army with unique pieces representing infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots, all with the shared goal of utterly annihilating everyone else on the board. Alliances were formed with the silent mutual understanding that they would be viciously betrayed at the most devastating moment possible. It was a game designed to test strategic genius, encourage backstabbing, and probably ruin countless friendships, much like a modern game of Monopoly. This was the preferred pastime of kings and warriors, a portable battlefield for ancient military nerds. 4. It seems the ancient Chinese elite, drowning in a sea of luxurious boredom, decided that the next great spectator sport should be cricket fighting. And no, that's not a clever metaphor. We're talking about actual insects, tiny 6-legged gladiators, being thrust into miniature fighting pits while wealthy nobles in silk robes placed massive bets and screamed encouragement. These weren't just random bugs. Champion crickets were bred, trained, and fed special diets to become tiny killing machines. They had fans, rivalries, and legacies. Can you imagine explaining to your family that you lost the estate betting on a grasshopper named Lord Chirpington? It was a spectacle that was simultaneously adorable, deeply weird, and taken with terrifying seriousness. 5. Now, let's head over to ancient Greece for the symposium, which sounds sophisticated but was essentially a high-class toga party that always spiraled into glorious chaos. The night would start with some high-minded philosophical debate, but after a few jugs of wine, it would inevitably descend into competitive poetry slams, terrible drunken singing, and bizarre party games. Professional entertainers, often scantily clad, would dance and play music while the greatest minds of the era engaged in intellectual drinking games where a bad rhyme meant you had to chug. It was as if a prestigious university lecture slowly and beautifully devolved into a wild frat party. Philosophy and debauchery, all in one glorious package. 6. In ancient Egypt, they celebrated the Festival of Drunkenness, and it's even more incredible than it sounds. According to myth, the lion-headed goddess of destruction, Sekhmet, was about to wipe out all of humanity in a divine rage. The gods saved the day by tricking her into drinking a river of beer dyed red to look like blood. She got blackout drunk, passed out, and humanity was spared. So, to honor this miracle and keep her appeased, the Egyptians held a massive annual festival where the main religious duty was to get absolutely, spectacularly hammered. It was a sacred obligation to party until you couldn't stand. Priests, nobles, commoners, everyone participated in this holy bender to save the world. 7. You think sports fans are intense today? They have nothing on ancient Roman chariot racing enthusiasts. These guys didn't just paint their faces and shout insults. They actively practiced black magic to sabotage the competition. They would commission curse tablets, thin sheets of lead inscribed with detailed, gruesome curses calling on underworld gods and demons to mess up the opposing teams. We're talking prayers for charioteers to crash, for their horses to get sick, and for their bodies to be twisted and broken. These curses were then secretly buried near the racetrack or in graves to maximize their dark power. It was fan devotion taken to a whole new level of supernatural pettiness. 8. Finally, let's talk about Pancration, the ancient Olympic sport that was basically a no-holds-barred fight to the death for a leafy crown. It was a horrifying mashup of boxing, wrestling, and a dirty back-alley brawl. There were virtually no rules. Eye gouging and biting were technically forbidden, but you know how that goes. Athletes would kick, punch, choke, and try to break each other's bones in front of a cheering crowd. One legendary fighter actually won his final match after he had already died. His opponent broke his ankle as he was being choked out, forcing a submission, but it was too late. The judges awarded the victory to the corpse. That's not sport, that's just pure, unadulterated madness. 9. Receiving a dinner invitation from Emperor Elagabalus was less of an honor, and more like being cast in an episode of a terrifying prank show. You might show up expecting fine wine and roasted peacock, but instead, you're greeted with a party favor of venomous snakes slithering around the dessert table. This emperor's idea of a good time was pure psychological warfare. He once released so many rose petals from the ceiling that several of his guests were literally suffocated in a fragrant floral avalanche. On other nights, he'd serve meticulously crafted food that looked exactly like human eyeballs and other gruesome body parts, just to watch his guests squirm. You never knew if you were attending a banquet or a bizarre interactive horror film. Leaving with a full stomach was a bonus. Leaving it all was a victory. 10. Picture the absolute chaos of a citywide office Christmas party combined with a role reversal reality show, and you're getting close to the Roman festival of Saturnalia. For one wild week in December, the entire famously rigid Roman social order was thrown into a blender. Slaves were suddenly waited on by their masters, who would don ridiculous outfits and act like complete fools. Strict laws against gambling were suspended, turning public squares into makeshift casinos. It was a time of pure, unadulterated mayhem, where feasting, heavy drinking, and giving absurd gifts were the law of the land. Your stoic, serious boss could be legally required to serve you wine while you drunkenly made fun of his toga. It was a beautiful citywide meltdown. 11. Forget your modern three-ring circus. The ancient Chinese 100 entertainments, or baixi, was a simultaneous explosion of 1,000 different kinds of awesome and terrifying. It was an all-out assault on the senses. On one side of the arena, acrobats twisted themselves into impossible shapes while jugglers casually tossed flaming swords back and forth. On the other, martial artists performed incredible feats of strength, while musicians played a thundering soundtrack. In the center, a man might be balancing a precarious tower of screaming goats on his forehead. It was a super show of such immense scale and danger that the main source of entertainment was wondering how in the world nobody had died yet. It was pure, glorious, and utterly overwhelming spectacle. 12. You think your weekend basketball game gets competitive? That's adorable. The ancient Mesoamericans played Olamalisli, a game where the stakes were literally life and death. The goal was to smack a 9-pound solid rubber ball through a stone hoop set high on a wall using only your hips and thighs. This wasn't a game of casual fun, it was a deeply sacred ritual. The ball represented the sun or moon, and the court was the world. The players were athletic marvels, but the pressure was immense, because it's widely believed that the losing team, and sometimes even the winning one, was ritually sacrificed to the gods afterward. Imagine trying to make a crucial play knowing that a mistake could lead to your immediate and very permanent retirement. 13. If you thought gladiators fighting each other was peak Roman brutality, allow me to introduce the opening act, the Venatians. These were massive, staged animal hunts in the arena that were arguably even more chaotic. We're not talking about one guy versus one lion. We're talking about organizers unleashing dozens of exotic, terrified, and furious animals at once just to see what would happen. Bears fighting tigers, elephants trampling wolves, and sometimes, for a real crowd pleaser, they'd just release a pack of hyenas onto a group of condemned criminals. Specially trained hunters called bestiarii would face these beasts with minimal armor, providing a thrilling and often very brief display of courage for the roaring, bloodthirsty crowds. It was state-sponsored carnage as family entertainment. 14. Long before organized sports and safety-tested playgrounds, ancient Greek kids were masters of unsupervised, chaotic fun. Their version of hide-and-seek took place among the sprawling columns of sacred temples, where knocking over an offering to Athena was a genuine risk. But their real passion was for the trochus, or hoop rolling. This wasn't a gentle pastime. It was a high-speed, full-contact sport where kids would whack metal hoops with sticks, racing them through crowded marketplaces and probably tripping a few famous philosophers in the process. It was pure, toga-clad anarchy fueled by honey and youthful energy, where the only rules were the ones you made up on the spot, and every game ended in a shouting match. 15. Before streaming services and podcasts, you had ancient bards, who were basically a one-man entertainment multiverse. These weren't just quiet poets. They were rock stars. A bard would roll into town and put on a show featuring epic poems recited from memory for hours, lively songs accompanied by a lyre, and a healthy dose of dirty jokes to keep the crowd engaged. They were the walking, talking libraries of their culture. But they were also the news, the comedy club, and the local drama rolled into one. A good bard could make a hall of hardened warriors weep with a tragic tale, then have them roaring with laughter a minute later. They were the original content creators, and their stage was anywhere they could draw a crowd. 16. And now for Senet, the ancient Egyptian board game that came with the highest stakes imaginable, your immortal soul. On the surface, it looked like a simple race game played on a long, decorated board. But to the Egyptians, Senet was a simulation of the perilous journey through the underworld. Each move you made, dictated by the throw of sticks, was a step closer to judgment by the gods. Landing on a good square could grant you divine favor, while landing on a bad one could set you back or symbolize a demonic attack. Winning the game meant you had successfully navigated the afterlife. Losing? Well, let's just say you might be facing an eternity of being chewed on by Ammit, the soul-devouring crocodile-lion-hippo monster. No pressure. 17. Let's take a stroll down a much darker alley of ancient entertainment, public executions. While it sounds horrifying to us, for centuries this was a legitimate form of public spectacle. Think of it as the original true crime series, except it was live, unedited, and happening in your town square. Large crowds would gather, sometimes with the atmosphere of a twisted festival, complete with food stalls and people selling souvenirs. It was a gruesome combination of state-enforced justice and morbid curiosity. Families might pack a lunch and make a day of it, jostling for a good view of a hanging or a beheading. It was a chillingly effective deterrent, for sure, but it was also a communal gathering, a horrifying form of entertainment that reminds us how thin the line between justice and spectacle can be. 18. Persian polo, or chavgan, was less of a sport and more of a high-speed cavalry battle with a ball. Imagine nobles and royalty, who clearly had a questionable sense of self-preservation, charging across a field on horseback at reckless speeds. They'd swing heavy, long-handled mallets, trying to hit a small ball while simultaneously trying to avoid being trampled. knocked off their horse by an opponent, or getting their skull cracked by a stray backswing. Safety equipment was apparently for peasants. The game was a chaotic, beautiful, and incredibly dangerous dance of horsemanship and aggression. Kings and emperors were huge fans, sponsoring teams and placing massive wagers. Injuries weren't just a risk, they were an expected part of the fun. 19. Forget the modern Olympics with its focus on global unity and peak human performance. The ancient Greek version was more like a wild, week-long religious festival that just happened to have some sports. For starters, all the athletes competed completely naked. The official reason was something about reducing wind resistance, but it was probably more about showing off their godlike physiques. Some events were just bizarre, like the Hoplitodromos, a foot race where competitors had to sprint while wearing 50 pounds of bronze armor. And if you were a married woman, you were banned from even watching, on penalty of being thrown off a cliff. Unmarried women, however, were welcome. The logic is a bit hard to follow, but it certainly made for a unique spectacle. 20. The Minoans on the island of Crete had a form of entertainment that makes bull riding look like a gentle nap. It was called bull leaping. The concept was simple in its insanity. A young athlete would run directly at a charging, angry bull, grab its horns at the last possible second, and use the bull's momentum to vault acrobatically over its back, hopefully landing on their feet. We know this was a real thing because it's depicted in countless vibrant frescoes. Was it a religious ceremony? A rite of passage? Or just the favorite pastime of a civilization of adrenaline junkies with a death wish? Whatever it was, it stands as one of history's most baffling and dangerous forms of fun. 21. Ancient acrobats, especially the female performers in Egypt, were on a whole other level of flexibility and daring. These weren't just gymnasts. They were human contortionists who performed feats that seemed to defy the laws of anatomy. They would bend themselves into mind-boggling shapes while balancing on unstable objects, and sometimes even on the backs of confused lions. Surviving artwork shows them in poses that would make a modern yoga instructor's spine ache just by looking at it. They often performed in revealing outfits for audiences of wealthy, wine-soaked nobles, making them the stars of a very strange and dangerous precursor to Cirque du Soleil. They were the ultimate party trick in a world that clearly valued spectacle over safety. 22. If you think ancient Greek theater was all serious drama and profound monologues, you've been seriously misled. The comedies, particularly those by playwrights like Aristophanes, were the complete opposite. Imagine respected actors on a grand stage, wearing enormous fake phalluses, telling the kind of lowbrow jokes you'd hear in a middle school locker room. The audience wasn't politely clapping either. They were an active part of the show, shouting, booing, and even throwing food at the performers if they didn't like a scene. It was a raucous, interactive experience that was less like a stuffy night at the theater and more like a chaotic citywide roast where no topic was off limits and audience participation was mandatory. 23. Let me introduce you to a wonderfully bizarre ancient Greek game called Ephodmos. It sounds like something invented by a group of bored kids, and it probably was. One person would get on another person's back, and the person carrying them would be blindfolded and spun around until they were hopelessly dizzy. Their goal was then to stumble around and find a specific stone marker, all while being heckled and misdirected by everyone watching. It was essentially a recipe for hilarious disaster, a game of blindfolded piggyback chaos that almost certainly ended with someone face-planting spectacularly. While historians might say it taught trust and coordination, it was more likely about seeing which of your friends would fall over first. 24. Gladiators were the biggest celebrities of the Roman Empire. They were more than just fighters. They were cultural icons, the rock stars of their day. The public was absolutely obsessed with them. Fans would write graffiti praising their favorite fighters on city walls, and a bizarre market for gladiator-themed merchandise thrived. You could actually buy vials of gladiator sweat, which was believed to be an aphrodisiac, scraped from their bodies after a match. The fandom was intense and sometimes violent. If a beloved gladiator was killed in the arena, his most hardcore fans were known to commission curse tablets to bring ruin and misery upon the man who defeated him. It was a level of celebrity worship that makes modern fandom look tame. 25. The Scythian warriors, the legendary nomadic horsemen of the steppe, had a victory celebration that was both a terrifying power move and a masterpiece of grim recycling. After defeating a worthy enemy in battle, they wouldn't just take his sword as a souvenir. Oh no, they would carefully prepare the man's skull, sometimes lining it with gold for a touch of class, and turn it into a fully functional drinking cup. Imagine sitting around the campfire, toasting your victory by drinking fermented mare's milk out of the cranium of the guy you just defeated, all while bragging about how you did it. It was the ultimate show of dominance, a chilling warning to their enemies, and probably a very awkward conversation starter at parties. 26. Welcome to Kotabos, the favorite party game of the ancient Greeks, which was essentially a more chaotic and sophisticated version of beer pong. The goal was to take the dregs at the bottom of your wine cup and fling them across the room to hit a target, usually a small metal disc. All the while, you were supposed to shout the name of the person you had a crush on. If you hit the target, it was a sign they liked you back. If you missed, you just made a sticky mess and looked like a fool. It was a game of skill, luck, and drunken romantic desperation, proving that even the greatest philosophical minds in history enjoyed a bit of gloriously dumb, projectile-based fun. 27. Long before poker chips and playing cards, the go-to game of chance was Knucklebones. And these weren't plastic toys. They were the actual polished ankle bones of sheep or goats. This simple game fueled everything from innocent children's pastimes to full-blown gambling addictions that could ruin lives. People would bet anything and everything on the toss of these bones: money, livestock, property, and in moments of true desperation, even their own freedom. It was a high-stakes world where your entire fortune could be decided by the random bounce of a piece of a dead farm animal. Talk about putting it all on the line. 28. A Viking feast wasn't just a meal, it was an endurance sport. Imagine a giant smoke-filled hall packed with huge bearded warriors, all competing to see who could eat the most roasted meat, drink the most mead, and tell the most outrageous stories. These were not quiet, polite affairs. They were roaring, chaotic celebrations of life, where boasting was an art form and friendly arguments could easily escalate into fistfights. The honey wine flowed freely, fueling epic tales of battle and heroic deeds until the sun came up. If you could walk out of a Viking feast under your own power, you were considered a champion. It was a beautiful, deafening, and delicious form of organized chaos. 29. The Romans, in their infinite quest for spectacular entertainment, occasionally looked at the Colosseum and thought, you know what this place needs? A naval battle. So they would flood the entire arena floor, bring in actual warships, and force thousands of condemned prisoners to fight to the death in a full-scale mock sea battle called a Naumachia. It was a breathtakingly expensive and horrifyingly brutal spectacle. The crowds would cheer as ships rammed each other, men drowned, and the water turned red, all for their amusement. It was the ultimate demonstration of Rome's power and its insatiable appetite for violent entertainment, taking the concept of a dinner show to a truly terrifying and massive scale. 30. At a Celtic feast, getting the best cut of meat wasn't just a matter of asking nicely. The hero's portion, the biggest and best piece, was reserved for the bravest and most celebrated warrior in the room. This, of course, often led to heated disagreements. If two or more warriors felt they deserved the honor, the dispute would be settled right there, in the middle of the feast. It would start with boasts and insults, and if that didn't work, it would escalate into a full-blown duel with swords and axes. Imagine a dinner party where the argument over who gets the last piece of steak could end in a fight to the death. It made for a very tense but undoubtedly memorable dining experience. 31. If you stumbled upon a puppet show on the streets of ancient Rome, you weren't in for a charming children's story. These shows were the exact opposite. Roman street puppets were crude, lewd, and gloriously violent. The plots often revolved around slapstick humor, political satire, and jokes so dirty they'd make a modern comedian blush. The puppets themselves were often grotesque, with exaggerated features, and the shows would feature simulated beatings and decapitations, all to the roaring laughter of the crowd, which included plenty of children. It was a raw, unfiltered, and often disgusting form of street theater that pulled no punches and was definitely not for the faint of heart. 32. Forget polite poetry readings. The Vikings had a tradition called flyting, which was essentially a verbal duel, a rap battle to the death. Two warriors would stand face to face and trade elaborate, rhyming insults, each trying to outdo the other in creativity and viciousness. They would attack each other's honor, courage, ancestry, and physical appearance with brutal, poetic precision. The goal was to utterly humiliate your opponent in front of the entire community. Sometimes the loser would just have to accept their defeat and shattered ego. Other times, the war of words would escalate into an actual war with axes. It was the ultimate test of wit and nerve, where a sharp tongue was just as important as a sharp sword. So there it is, 32 reminders that our ancestors were masters of unhinged entertainment. But we know the vault of historical weirdness is bottomless, and you people in the comments always know things we don't. So we're officially issuing a challenge. What is the one mind-numbingly bizarre form of ancient fun that we completely ignored? School us. Show us what we missed, prove us wrong in the comments below. And while you're at it, destroy that like button and subscribe.